This is the Ground Game Podcast, where we cover politics from the ground up. Here are your hosts, Tom Lobianco and Patrick Fingston.
Hey guys, Tom Lobianco here, one half of the Ground Game Podcast. My friend and colleague Patrick Fingston is out on paternity leave with their beautiful new second baby Margaret, and he'll be back in about a week. So you got me holding down the fort for a little bit, and today I've got, as we reflect on the life and legacy of Jimmy Carter, today I've got on excellent reporter and the author of the book Camelot's End, which is all about the 1980 Democratic primary. I've got Jon Ward, a former colleague. We used to work together at Yahoo News. And if you haven't already, make sure you go out and buy his book, Camelot's End. He also wrote a very good book about growing up in the evangelical movement called Testimony, both of which are incredibly thoughtful. So, Jon Ward, I'll bring you on here. Jon, thanks for being on.
Tom, thanks for having me. And my mini pitch for my book is, if you don't want to read a full bio of Carter, it's kind of a dual bio of Carter and Ted Kennedy, and it's the story of their collusion in 1980. So it's a mini bio of Carter. The full bio you want to get is, probably Kai Bird's or Jonathan Alter's that came out in the last few years.
Well, how did it, you know what, man? I remember when this, came out probably about 5 years ago. And I remember thinking at the time, I was like, we're all so awash in Trump, constant Trump, nonstop Trump. And this is really fascinating to me. And, certainly, I mean, appropriate now in understanding him and his legacy and the redefinition of his legacy. But how did you come to this? I mean, how did you decide that this was the story that you needed to tell?
I fell into it, like a lot of good stories. It was 2013, early 2013. I'd been looking for a book idea for a while and sort of just ran into some folks talking about it randomly. And as soon as I heard the story of Carter chasing Kennedy around the stage on the last night of the convention, I think 80 million people watching on television. Wow. And Kennedy, drunk in front of that huge audience. So that kind of captured my imagination, that one moment. And then I quickly figured out that nobody had really done a book treatment of just that particular campaign, because everybody focused on, in 1980, everybody focused generally on Reagan and his victory and the impact he had, and so it was kind of an undertold story. Democrats didn't really want to talk about it either, because it was
Can't imagine why.
Not a happy chapter for them. Kennedys didn't want to talk about it. They don't like to lose. Carter didn't want to talk about it. He hates losing. So it was a good story from that perspective, because nobody had really been cooperative to that point. And I got some cooperation. Carter talked to me. The Kennedys generally did not. And still to this, well, I can't say to this day, I haven't been back there, but to the day that I published the book, the Ted Kennedy, Institute and Museum up in Boston, there's no mention of the fact that he ran for president in 1980.
Yeah, that's interesting, man. That is... Yeah,
Paul Kane and I from the Washington Post, we were there for maybe the dedication of the center, and we both kind of noticed that going through it. Yeah,
that's as we both know as reporters, so much of the story is what is not told, as opposed to what's blared out there, across the Twitters of the world.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, looking back on this, because, we've had a fair amount of time to prep for this. And, this, since he moved into hospice care after Rosalind passed away, I mean, what is your overall assessment of Jimmy Carter's impact on America? I mean, 100 years is a stretch. That is a long time. And you almost had like two different versions of Carter in the public mind. What's your assessment of him and his legacy?
It's funny, if you write out his birth date and death date just by the numbers, it looks kind of weird because it's, I think it's 10-1, 24.
Yeah.
12, 29, 24.
Wow.
It's kind of crazy.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to kind of capture his impact or his life. I think his impact on America is one thing. His impact on the world is another, because his post-presidency, he improved the lives of literally millions of people, many of whom were outside this country, many of whom were in, impoverished countries, disease-ridden countries. So I think in all, if I had to sum it up, I think he is already becoming a towering figure, and will continue to grow in stature over time. The biggest point of debate is always going to be how to characterize his presidency. There's really no debate about, how good of a man he was and how great of an ex-president he was. And quite frankly, there's really no debate about how savvy and skilled a politician he was. Because anybody who studies, his rise through Georgia politics to the presidency, has to acknowledge that. What I think, there's no doubt he had some serious weaknesses as a president. And I think one of the, there's two things here with his presidency. One is, were some of his weaknesses as a president the result of like the context of modern politics, where sincerity and truthfulness doesn't play well? Was he the victim of some of these kinds of things? And then the second thing is just the policy debate, right? Like inflation, hostages, the economy, a couple other big issues really sunk his presidency. And there's a quite healthy debate about how much credit he gets versus Reagan for bringing down inflation, for releasing the hostages, and for defeating the Soviet Union. Those three kind of issues,
interesting,
are really sort of at the core of what the case for Reagan is, for why he was a better president than Carter. And there's no doubt things improved on all those fronts under Reagan's presidency. But there's a pretty robust case to be made that Carter, started the progress and should get some of the credit for it as well. He appointed Paul Volcker to the Fed, and Volcker, was instrumental in bringing down inflation. The Carter administration did most of the work to get the hostages released, and Reagan got the credit because they were released as Reagan, was taking the oath of office. And then, on the Soviet Union, Bob Gates, former defense secretary from multiple presidents, has said that, Carter put human rights at the center of our foreign policy, which nobody had done before. And he also increased defense spending, which most people don't really realize. And those two things kind of put the Soviet Union on an unsustainable trajectory. They couldn't keep up on the spending, and they couldn't compete on the global, stage in terms of moral high ground and that sort of thing. If we were placing human rights at the center of our foreign policy, so his presidency was unsuccessful in some major ways, but I think that's the debate that's going to be interesting to watch play out over the next, several years.
I mean, in some ways, it sounds almost like you're talking about the end of the Biden presidency.
It could be. I mean, just to divert for a second. I mean, the Times, New York Times, did a piece recently about the number of border crossings or immigrants who have crossed over into the country under the Biden presidency. And I mean, I was just shocked by the incredible increase of that, and kind of shocked politically the the Biden administration wouldn't have taken it more seriously, given how potent that issue was for Trump in 16 and 20. So, that's a total, rabbit trail there. But,
Well, that's important, though, because it gets to this. It feels like, to the extent there are similarities and allegories here, or analogous moments here, it would come from the two of them focusing on the policy, on the seriousness of the office and the job, the gravitas of it, while seemingly completely missing the public perception and the importance of the public in this space, because ultimately, the presidency is and should be, responsive to the public and public concerns.
And I think what you were talking about with Biden was like the industrial base rejuvenation. All the infrastructure spending, all that sort of thing. I think there is going to be certainly, a reckoning down the road with what's been accomplished under Biden. But to the point you made second there about sort of playing to the type versus playing to the substance, I think if Biden was ignoring public, first of all, I don't put immigration in that bucket of sort of aesthetics. That's hard policy. And for them to be so lax on the border is, in my opinion, political malpractice. But to the extent that the Biden presidency was not effective in playing the show business game, I think that was different than Carter, because it was a function over the last year or two of him just not being able to physically do it.
Yeah.
There's a picture of Carter, though, in the White House, might be on the front page of the New York Times website. I think it was during Obama's presidency, like maybe right after he got inaugurated. And it's Obama speaking, and then Clinton's next to him. And I think
I see it. Yeah.
So it's on his right shoulder, W's on his left shoulder, Clinton's to the left of W, and then Carter's out on the wing there.
Wow.
And the whole piece is about how in the President's Club, Carter was the odd man out. And I think this really gets to something key about Carter, which is he didn't yearn to belong. Like he was his own man. And I think for much of his presidency, for most of his presidency, and for much of his life, those kinds of things, him standing on the outside, was viewed as weak. I think this is really the core paradox, or revelation, the apocalypse, apocalypse being used as a revelation, right, of Jimmy Carter's presidency, which is his perceived weakness was often an indictment of American culture, because it was usually, casting aspersions and sneering at something that was actually true strength. And his willingness to stand outside, the club there in the Oval Office, that takes immense self-regard and self-confidence and strength of personality. And that's something that runs throughout his life and his political career. Not always for, pragmatic success. Like, he was not good at schmoozing when he was president. He wanted everything to work in a rational manner, and he wasn't always willing to sort of invite the congressman, the annoying squeaky wheel congressman, on Air Force One. And, you get him to vote for your bill if you just make that little, play to his vanity. But he often wasn't willing to do that. And that did hurt his presidency. But
is that integrity or self-righteousness?
I think it's both. I mean, he had incredible personal integrity. Probably, the highest of any person to ever hold that office. but it's like it's the shadow self, right? The person who has the most integrity is also going to be sorely tempted to be self-righteous because he has a lot of grounds to be so, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, he was self-righteous. He was hard on others, just like he was on himself, and that didn't always work out well. But that drive is there from the beginning. I mean, he was the last president to live in poverty. Like no president. Now you could say Barack Obama came up, middle class or lower middle class.
Yeah.
But Jimmy Carter, he didn't have electricity till he was age 10.
Wow.
And his parents owned land. They were not, on a subsistence income.
Yeah.
And, his father, who was a segregationist, they had black sharecroppers, working their property. So it's not as if they were hand to mouth, but no electricity. They didn't have toilet paper for a long time just because it wasn't a common luxury. These are things that we just kind of can't wrap our head around these days, but that's what life was like for a lot of people 100 years ago. So he was, and so out of that he willed himself to the Naval Academy. Took over his father's business, which was in debt after his father died. Gave up his dreams, kind of like Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life.
Yeah.
To take over his father's business, brought it out of debt, rebuilt it, became a successful businessman, navigated, segregation and the backlash to the civil rights movement with a fairly high degree of integrity and skill. Like he wasn't looking for trouble, but he took some key stands at the right times, and then kind of again willed himself into the state Senate against incredible odds. I mean, there was a political machine in Southwest Georgia, local machine that was stuffing ballot boxes, and he stood up to them and got the election result overturned to get himself elected to the state Senate, in part by working with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. So, from there he became governor, and then ran for governor unsuccessfully, and then came back at it. And then the fact that he would even think of running for president was laughable, but he benefited from the changes to the Democratic to the primary system because.
I wanted to ask you, about that point. I think is it 1966 where he loses and he, as he says, becomes born again and starts reading the teachings of Reinhold Niebuhr.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that what don't only have you here as a Carter expert, but you've always had a great perspective on things, being raised in the evangelical movement and understanding faith in a way that a lot of journalists often don't. And you wrote this piece here. It's up at Yahoo News called "How Jimmy Carter's Christian Faith Shaped His Life." How did that moment? And what did that, when he lost and became born again, as he says, how did that shape him?
If I could have talked to Carter for, more than the time I had him for, this is what I would have wanted to know. And it's one of the most interesting things about him, which is he had a very deep, profound, and sincere religious faith, which, as you said, kind of was reignited or deepened at that point in 1966. He's 42 at that point.
Yeah.
And has just gone through one of the only times, he was rejected or unsuccessful. And he actually went up to, I think, the Boston or Massachusetts area and went door to door with other Baptists proselytizing.
Wow.
To help set up a church up there. And he talks about how, some of his most meaningful encounters with the Holy Spirit were during that time. The Reinhold Niebuhr was a theologian at that time and an author. And I've actually tried reading some Niebuhr, and it's often like impenetrable. Like it's
Really?
it's so dense. Yeah, I mean, I still aspire to read more of him partly for this reason. But from other accounts of sort of Carter's integration of his faith with political philosophy, his reading of Niebuhr led him to adopt a very sort of nebulous political philosophy to me, which is, you aspire to implement your faith through politics, but you recognize that the world is fallen and complex and will never be made right until, the coming of all things, if you're a Christian, or, many faiths believe in some sort of, redemption story. So I think, to avoid going too far down into the weeds of all that, I think the important thing in terms of how it worked itself out here is that Carter, like any politician, sought power, and he did seek to live out his faith in politics. But he was unlike a lot of Christian politicians or politicians who use the label Christian since the rise of the moral majority. He was different from them in that he didn't worship power. And I think it's Catherine Stewart has a book called The Power Worshippers, and that's something that I've just sort of been contemplating recently as I think about people who will say or do seemingly anything to get power, and then justify a lot of it by slapping a flag and a cross onto it. John Prine has that great song, your flag decal won't get you into heaven anymore. And that's, a lot of what we see happening these days. And it comes down to the worship of power. It's the desire for power that is so overwhelming that you will do or say anything to get it. And Carter, like I think every politician and all of us, I think it's a very human dilemma, and we all encounter it probably every day, because we all are, handling power in different ways. We're seeking power in different ways. We're being denied power in different ways. And I think that, but in politics, it's a unique challenge, and part of the job is to seek power. So I think Carter, probably crossed the line into doing or saying things that, he shouldn't have done. There's one moment in particular where he stretched the facts of what was happening with the hostages to sort of get himself over the line in a key primary state. I remember that in the spring of 1980. There's moments like that, but generally his presidency and his life were characterized by integrity and not by doing or saying anything to get power.
It's funny to me because it seems like a depending on how it's treated, like a perverting or a bastardizing of the in this world but not of this world of Christian faith, and how you decide to handle that, especially with certain folks on the politicized Christian right.
Say more about that. What do you mean by bastardizing it?
Well, how you choose to live, when you're in this world.
Yeah.
Right. If you're not of this world, what do you do here? Right. And if it's only about, as you note here, a complete and total aggregation of power to the deficit of all else, not, behaving as a Christian and what most people would consider to be, acts of selflessness, charity, service, that most folks associate with Jesus. That it then becomes that it's in logic, reductio ad absurdum, taking a concept to its absurdist extreme.
I think what you've seen to to create some of the dynamics you're describing is it's theological and it's also political. I mean, the theological aspect of it is if you do as Carter did and you make your life a life of service and of integrity. I think the service comes from a theological belief that what we do here every day on this earth matters, and that the earth itself and the material creation matters. And there are strong theological currents in fundamentalist Protestantism, as there are in fundamentalist movements in many religions, that veer towards what some would call Gnosticism, which is the idea that the material world is either bad or dispensable or disposable. And the left behind mentality in Christianity, the idea that we're all going to be raptured and those who know God will be taken up and those who do not will be left behind for a tribulation and then it'll all be burned. That along with sort of an overemphasis on justification by faith alone, that creates this mentality among many that like what we do here doesn't really matter.
It's almost like a nihilism.
100%. Yeah. And then the political aspect is, I think that the Republican Party has effectively sort of stamped a lot of its policy positions, fused it, I guess, with evangelical religious sort of culture and belief, so that a lot of people on the right, I think, have a hard time distinguishing between opinions and beliefs they have as to whether they are religious or political. And they might be able to tease it out, if they talked about it. But a lot of times they kind of swim in the same pool. And a lot of it has to do with how we behave towards the poor, especially from a government policy position.
Yeah, it's never challenged, which is fairly unsurprising in modern politics. The tribalism of politics, and certainly a good amount of that orthodoxy, so to say, happens on the left among the Democrats as well on different issues. You write about, and of course, Camelot's End is focused, is built around the 1980 Democratic primary. There are a couple of things that you write about in there, which I thought were very fascinating. The primary itself and that process, starting out with a massive field, like akin to what the Republicans saw in 2016, which ultimately got us Trump.
Right.
And you also talk about this dynamic of the old South versus the new South, and people worried about George Wallace potentially claiming the Democratic nomination back then. Tell us a little bit about that primary and how that ultimately got Carter to the White House.
You got to be careful you don't get me going too much on this stuff, because I think one of the great things for me personally to come out of working on that book was to better understand the fact that the way we elect people to office and in general and to the presidency in particular is not the way it's always been done. And I think that realization is not widely shared. I think most of us just think this is the way it's always been done, and that limits our imagination for what we can do going forward. Up into the 60s, nominees for president were generally chosen by the political parties and their insiders.
Yeah.
Primaries had come about early 20th century, and they had made a dent in the machine. But generally, if you look at the 68 results, for example, Hubert Humphrey got a couple 100,000 votes, and Bobby Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy both got, I think, in the millions each. But the nominee was Humphrey. Because the nominees were chosen at the convention by the parties. And then, of course, you have the violence in the streets in Chicago at that convention. And that leads the Democrats to adopt a series of reforms to make their nominating process for president more democratic. Over 50 years, we have democratized our process to the point now where it is actually less democratic. Maybe not less democratic than 68, but certainly less democratic than it was intended to be. And you could make the case that it is less democratic than it was when the party bosses chose it, because rather than a few hundred political insiders who understand what it requires to govern and get things done, now we have a couple million, outsiders who choose our nominees for the rest of us, who don't understand anything about how to get stuff done in politics and simply want their guy to beat up on the other guy, which leaves the tens or hundreds of millions of the rest of us left with two, subpar choices to choose from in the general election.
Interesting.
So that all started in the 70s, and Carter, came up with some younger operatives who understood the changes and adopted to them, and they ran sort of a full primary campaign in 76 to overtake the rest of the field. There was some fear of Wallace getting the nomination or at least representing the South. And Carter, played some hardball in Florida, I think it was, to get consolidate support among the Democrats. But yeah, he was representative of a new South at that time because he was not a segregationist.
That's a BFD.
In 76, right? It doesn't seem that long ago.
I'm laughing in part because it seems so much of, if you think back to selecting Humphrey over McCarthy in 68, you picked the more moderate, so to say, or more establishment, somebody who would appeal to the broader electorate, as opposed to the base.
Yeah. Right.
It was less based, and in that sense, it would seem to justify smoke-filled back rooms as a deciding factor over the primary process, because that's how we've gotten these extreme politicians, or at least people who appear and act in extreme ways.
Yeah, and there's still a pretty robust conversation going about how we could reform the system now. I think if you got rid of party primaries, didn't open, like basically the Alaska system is the one that makes the most sense to me. There are objections that it doesn't help strengthen parties, and I share that concern. I think we need strong parties because they're really important institutions. But I think an open primary system like Alaska, what they do is they have a primary and anybody can run in it from any party, and the top 5 finishers or top 4, I think it's top 5, all advance to the general. And then they choose the general election winner on ranked choice voting, and that happens a few months later. I think that could still strengthen parties. I think parties could actually create bigger tents because they would see the need to compete for more voters, and not sort of double and triple down on their base. But I don't think we have to go back to smoke-filled rooms is the point. I think we do need to recognize and value the input of people who understand politics and governance. I think we need to value that more. But structurally, I don't think we need to go back to smoke-filled rooms.
Yeah. How in the last couple of minutes we have here, how's we have with the passing of Carter, we have such a broad national discussion right now about the public's reevaluation of him and the reevaluation of him as a person, even his presidency. But how did your view and understanding of Carter shape and develop as you were reporting this?
Yeah, I think it is pretty simply said that he kind of transformed from a soft-spoken, mealy-mouthed, weak guy in a sweater to a steely-eyed, steel-backboned man of integrity and deep faith. Incredible strength, incredible determination. Do not get in his way, you know. But also like a devoted and exemplary husband. And I'll probably never get over the fact that after being president, he went back to his hometown, lived the rest of his life in a very simple home, in a very out of the way, very, very simple, small Southern town. And he got to work, and he spent, the next 4 decades eradicating disease and improving the lives of millions of people who could never thank him or do anything for him, building homes in America through Habitat for Humanity and across the world, strengthening democracy in countries that were, on the brink, and trying to bring peace in war zones. He is a personal hero of mine, and I think he's a towering figure in American history and human history.
Incredible, John. And thank you for all of your work on this, man. I mean, your insights are invaluable, and you've always been one of the deepest, most thoughtful journalists that I know, and I hear that all the time when I'm out and about in the field. And I reflected here. I'm so glad that you're with us on the Ground Game podcast.
Tom, it's good to see your face. I'm proud of you for staying in the field. And, I wish you the best in 25.
Thank you, brother.
Yep.
All right, guys, it's Jon Ward, Ward, Jon, no H. Go find his book. All right. It's Camelot's End. And he also wrote a very good memoir called Testimony about growing up in the evangelical movement and his deep religious faith, his faith journey. And it does not always lead where everyone's faith journey leads. Every person's faith journey is their own. And it's very thoughtful and very useful for understanding this moment that we're in. John, thank you, brother.
Thank you, Tom.
Hey, guys, thanks for watching this episode of the Ground Game podcast. Patrick and I always like to have on very informative and thoughtful and level-headed guests. If you'd like to get every episode new delivered straight to you, make sure you hit that subscribe button down there. If you're on the YouTube page, you can also head over to www.24sight.news. That's the number 24sight.news, and subscribe there. And I send out the Ground Game podcast, and that'll be delivered direct to your email inboxes. As always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.